captioning.
I got the captioning there for you
Yes, sir.
before you even had to remind me.
That's right.
Don't get used to it. So this morning I woke up and I come up here, had a good leisurely waking up because I didn't have to be here till 9 o'clock. And on my way over, my wife calls me up and said, "Guess what? I tested positive for COVID."
Oh,
And so all of a sudden I'm scrambling because I knew I had a live class today and everything. And so I went and took a COVID test and I'm negative. I've never been so happy to be negative in my life. Right? And to get so many negative reports about other people.
Is she okay?
She is. She's just, she just thought it was flu. We'd given her a test a couple days ago and she was negative, but this morning at school they tested her again. So that's not a bad thing. She'll just be at home for a few days and hopefully everything's okay. It worked out really well for me because I can stay home with her because Raleigh's speaking this weekend, so I can stay relatively isolated with her, So but that's just one interaction that I've had this week, and I've had a lot of other interesting interactions that led me to, I think, a good way to be able to introduce, I think, where we need to talk today. I had 4 different conversations with 4 different families about hospice, right? And moving their loved one to hospice. And so I had to practice my hospice spiel. Have I told you my hospice spiel before? Would you like to hear it?
yes.
It has to do with this. Most of the time, and most of the medical community defines life in opposition to death, right? And tries to do something that way. Hospice works differently. Instead of death, it puts something like dullness in opposition to life. That the lack of vibrancy, the lack of energy, that's the opposite of. And so it's literally fullness versus dullness is what is where hospice tries to live. And they can't promise longer life, but they can promise, they try to give richer life, however it happens to be. I think that's exactly what Bishop Spong is trying to talk about as well. And most of the time through Christian history, we've fallen back into, well, if it's not life, then it must be death. And if it's not death, then we have to bring a body back to life. And so we stay on that one spectrum where I think the important spiritual spectrum is where Dr. Spong is trying to draw us, and that's into fullness, richness, completeness of life. Where have you felt that type of life? Where is it in your life that has something sparkled in such a way that that time was a full time for you?
There have been moments when I was teaching kids
I think
that I felt the term sparkle clicked with me on that. There were moments that I was aware of. Sometimes there are moments that occur and I'm not aware of it until after it's all over with. Wow, that was really a good class, or that was really a good activity.
Yeah. And sometimes you literally don't recognize it until afterwards. Sometimes it takes a bit of perspective to see.
Yeah.
But someone in this afternoon's class, also a teacher, said there's times when she's writing stuff, preparing for something, that it feels like it is an out-of-body experience, and something's happening where she feels like, wow, where'd that inspiration come from?
Uh-huh.
That as well is the same type of thing that is a larger than resurrection, a larger than life thing, a resurrected set of viewing at things. That it's not just you in this physical space. Where else have you experienced, and where else do you experience heightened life?
I've had quite a lot of experience in a hospice setting. Years ago, when the AIDS crisis was at its peak, I sat by a lot of bedsides, and it was never a bad experience for me. It was, I always kind of related it to being at the airport and getting ready to go someplace else. And
Now that could be a bad experience,
These days,
especially
it's
if
not
you're
that,
in
you're right.
Dallas Airport.
but the interesting thing for me was I have a gift that I don't seem to have any fear of dying at all, none. And so it was easy for me to talk to my clients in a way that took the fear away from them. And my biggest challenge was that their families and their friends would come in the room and say, hang on, it's going to be fine, blah, 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 blah. And it wasn't going to be fine. These beautiful young men were in a horrible physical condition, and they weren't going to get better, and their quality of life was just gone completely.
Yeah.
And I would give them permission to go on.
Right.
And sometimes, one in particular I will never forget. I give him permission to go on and said it was going to be fine. And I don't know what I said, but I give him permission to go on. And I left and went home. And when I got home, the phone was ringing, telling me he passed away. He was just waiting for permission. And I feel as if I give it to him, in a way that it was not a bad thing.
Right.
And I don't believe that it is.
But John, I think that's because you've chosen to live in a different relationship to death than what is easily taught. We do a lot of stuff, especially in America, about hiding from, pushing ourselves away from death. And I think that's exactly the opposite of what Jesus was trying to do with us. He was trying to teach us beyond, right? That it's okay. And not the very fixed, we got it figured out beyond, but something that's undescribable in some ways.
Absolutely.
Because it's otherworldly,
Absolutely.
other than this.
Yes, and I was given the gift of that as a young child, and when I had polio, everybody expected me to die, and I didn't. And from that day to this, I've just not had any fear of dying. And sometimes I'm jealous when people go and leave behind this crazy world that we currently live in.
Yeah. How about the rest of you? Where have you experienced more than life?
Well, I can bring up something that happened today. So I had my mind on something else, and this woman was crying, their little daughter, and evidently her 14-year-old son had run away from home and was missing for 3 days, and she was upset.
Understandably.
And just being able to stop and be with her, and just I couldn't really see her phone. She wanted to show me the picture, and I said, what is his name, and talked about him, and just bringing that personal. I've been learning awareness meditation, and we're just so much on autopilot in real life. And death can be a reminder, not as a punishment for our sin, but as a reminder of our own mortality and to wake up.
Yeah. Thank you, Ron. Thank you. Anyone else?
For me, it's in nature.
Nature does a good job teaching us that, doesn't it?
That's where I find it. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes it's in the most interesting way, because sometimes nature teaches us that by the way it continually regenerates, and there's continual death, but continual life as well. And so it's in the very presence of death that we can learn not death from nature, right? Trees regenerate every single year. And we
So do
sometimes
we.
forget that about our own lives, don't we? Who are some of the people who helped you to learn about this? Who spoke life so well that you saw more than just the end of life type of stories? Who helped you to be able to know that?
David Wilkinson was really good at it.
David Wilkinson was amazing at it, wasn't he?
I'll throw mine in. My grandmother was, I guess by today's definition, she was probably a spiritualist. But she always talked about things that she saw, feelings that she had about, how can I say, entities that kind of would be there. And so when her friends would come over, they would kind of talk about it together. And it was just always a little fly on the wall. And heard these, older ladies talking about their beliefs and their experiences. And, sometimes when people are telling tales, it. Your gut tells you. And in this case, as they were talking, most of the time I felt, yeah, they're telling the truth. This is right. This is so anyway, I've always, I guess since I was a little kid, just never questioned that there was an afterlife. So and I've had a number of experiences myself that kind of go in that same direction, where people have died and I've known it before the telephone rang. So I don't know how to explain that, but it happens. So.
And here's the thing, Joyce. I think we do a lot of trying to explain it, or I should say, I think we sometimes do a lot of trying to negate their explaining of it, right? And tell them why they're wrong, why they do it, why that can't be the way it happens. But like the life after death group that meets here, I've talked a lot with their leadership and whatnot. And one of the things that's most powerful about that experience, because it doesn't matter whether I agree or think that's what happens. When I talk to them, I see that whatever they've experienced has moved them deeply. And so whatever I think about it, the truth is that they have something that unless I'm stupid, I have to give credence to. And we've often been stupid and tried to tell them why they're wrong, tell each other why we're wrong. But instead, wouldn't it be great if we would just sit in a space and say, marvelous.
I think as a little kid, you can do that because you have no perceived ideas. And so you know, and especially where somebody isn't trying to teach you something, you know, as the kid, you know, or indoctrinate you, and you're just hearing people talk, and you're allowed to use that, your intuition or whatever you want to call it, soul talk, so to speak. You just, you know, you can just learn a whole lot and judge for yourself. You know, you don't have to say, it's right or wrong or whatever. It's just like, well, that feels good or that feels not so good.
Yeah. But you do have to choose to suspend judgment of,
Yes.
right? You have to allow that to be whatever the experience is for that person. And you know what gets in the way of that? Whenever it's not like mine.
Yeah.
Right? If you told the same story I told, I would step right into it easily.
Mm-hmm.
It's when you tell something that is different.
Yeah.
I have coached myself when somebody shares something with me that is hard for me to believe or grasp a hold of. I have trained myself to say, well, I'm open to that. And that gives me the opportunity to learn more from their experience.
Can I tell you, John, that I think that what you're talking about, what Joyce kind of led us towards, was what this one chapter, you only had to read one chapter this week, and about ascension. And it flows out of resurrection. But it's a very interesting story, isn't it? It's about this, you know, the way Dr. Spong talks about it is he likens Jesus's ascension back to Elijah and Elisha. And if you think about it, in some ways it sounds like hey, look how much better I am than you because I got double the Spirit because of, but that's not how it's told. And that's not at all how the meaning is. But we do a lot of that, don't we? Look how my resurrection story is better than your resurrection story. Mm-hmm. Instead, it's the opposite. It's this person who's trying to deal with death and finds life in the midst of that, that instead of dying, he's carried off into something. And he feels his own spirit grow because of that. And in the same way, that's told at the same place as Jesus's ascension story, where Jesus dies, yet is alive and a marker for them of how to look towards heaven. And so they receive, like Elisha, a double portion of. So how do we let death become that which grows us, not that which makes us shrink? And in America, we do a lot of shrinking before death. And I think as a community, we have a very poor relationship with death. Not all of us, but there's a lot of it out there. And instead, this is trying to bring us to a different place.
So one thing I'm doing is I took a book I had from Stephen Levine, probably 20, 30 years old, and every year I meant to do it, which is to treat this year from New Year's Day 2022 till the end of this year, if I make it, as my last year.
Okay.
And go through all the preparation and do all the stuff that I haven't done, from the advanced directive to the estate planning to just writing a memoir, which I'm going to start a class on next week, and just going through that process. And I also would like to bring up the name of Janet Excel, who was did the IANS group at Catalina Methodist for many years, and she grew up Missouri Synod, but felt that never was a fit for her, and felt that even though we knew that people passed on to a better place, for the people here, we had to go through the grieving process, and that too, also being able to deal with the grief of physical separation is part of the process.
But you know what? You know why that's so difficult is because we identify a person so much with the body that they're in. And so the losing of that body means we have to shift from seeing dad's face or seeing dad's hands or feeling dad's hug to somehow feeling the presence of that without that physicality. And I got to tell you, my dad's been gone for decades now. And sometimes he feels as close as he did the last time I called him on the phone.
Yeah.
But it takes us having to transition. And I think that's what's scary for us.
It's not just scary, it can be mentally challenging.
Difficult and spiritually challenging.
Yes. You know, I had a hard time with the word God because it was bad over my head so much of my life.
Yeah.
And as I grew into as I stopped limiting, you know, if you try to describe God in Jewish faith, they don't like you to use the word because they don't want it described. Because if the minute you describe God, you limit God. So if my God is limitless, it can't have a form. But as soon as you take the form away, how do you pray? How do you feel the support? You know, it takes a huge leap, and it doesn't happen immediately to move God into a spiritual soul place, but rather than a physical being.
Yeah, and that more ephemeral place doesn't come naturally to us because we're used to all the other, aren't we? And yet, on a regular basis, we depend on somebody who is not in physical form with us to speak to us. I mean, when we read the Bible, we're expecting someone from some distant past to be able to speak to us, right?
Even if they don't know our language.
They may not even know our language, and yet you're right that they there we are expecting them to be able to speak to us.
Are we thinking that someone is, I mean, we're not thinking somebody's going to actually speak to us. We're just listening for what our brain interprets, aren't we?
Yeah, I think sometimes the hard part is this. Somebody might walk up to you and say, my dad spoke to me today. I don't know what they mean when they say that. And I might start off by saying, oh no, dead people don't talk that way. Maybe that's not what they meant at all. Do I stop myself from how I would correct them in order to hear what happened in that conversation that they had? Because maybe it was more of a spiritual speaking. Maybe it was they were reading a book and they heard their dad's voice in it. I don't know. But if I start off by correcting, I might miss the resurrection life that they're talking about. And we do a whole lot of correcting each other first. Go ahead, Pam. Welcome to 7:30 or 7 o'clock class. Pam usually comes to the 10 in the morning.
I almost didn't make it, but I got here. And I guess you're talking about interactions with people who say that they have that they have had contact with their loved ones or in some way or another after they've passed. And I wouldn't say that I had necessarily, but there are times when somebody will do something in the family and the first thought that crosses my mind is, you know, my dad would have loved that. Or my mom would just get such a kick out of so-and-so doing that. So that would be a way that I would say that I experience still being in contact with my loved ones.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if somebody comes out and says, you know, my mom said so-and-so to me, my response would probably just be, oh, that's really great, or that's interesting. Because none of us really knows. And how,
I beg to differ, Pam. The problem is that some of us think we know.
oh, well, that's true.
And so we do a lot of theology to define how we say, oh, this is how it works.
I've just been reading one of Thich Nhat Hanh's books, and it's really caught my attention sort of in this area because he is referring to the everlastingness of life and things, but in different forms. And it resonates with me really, because he again talked, as you did, about the forest regenerating itself, that an acorn doesn't look like it's like the tree, but it produces the tree. And he mentioned, you know, that he had a piece of ginger and it had just been laying there in the kitchen and he went to use it and it had sprouted. And so that we can find life in so many ways, and life can regenerate in so many ways, whether it may not be the same exact person or being or animal, but some of that former person, plant, or animal exists in what is passed on.
That's right. But to do that, I think we have to get beyond this body that I identify as Jim is so important that it has to.
Our bodies are too
exactly the
important
same
to us.
Yeah. And that's hard for us because we so self-identify with the body that we live in, whether we like all its pieces or not, that it's hard for us to identify beyond that. But at least that's part of what this sense of resurrection is that Dr. Spong is trying to push us towards, that it's not just this life, it's something greater and larger than just that, in our own individual cases and in the cases of all those around us. But what that means is that we have to go beyond whatever's, right? What is it that's more than just the small stories we tell? Because the small stories are controllable, but we get stuck in small stories. We get stuck in things that don't move us to our best, don't give the largest vision for what can happen. Do you remember when someone has given you a vision beyond yourself, more than you, drew you beyond whatever limit you thought there was? Those people, I think, are miraculous in that they show us a world that is so much more. I was talking to some folks today who we were talking about religious groups that essentially have such a tunnel vision, and they see this so well that they just can't even see beyond this. They're so focused this way. And I think a lot of what resurrection is that which draws us into that larger world and helps us see beyond the self-imposed limits of what our vision is.
in the, because I have the ebook for Unbelievable,
Uh-huh.
and in the preface, Spong talks about his out of body experience after he had a stroke, where he was able to look down on his body as it was being operated on, and there's a larger in the perennial wisdom. There's a notion that we are somehow all connected.
Yeah.
But it seems that particularly in Western cultures, we've become so focused on the I. And it was just interesting. David Brooks wrote a long piece about the breaking up of evangelicalism because of Trump. And he brought up the idea. It's interesting. He said the Protestants don't have a social justice. It's just that evangelical, actually they lost theirs. But when you start looking at beyond the individual, looking at structural racism and structural injustice, which is a part of the Bible, which has been forgotten with that emphasis on personal salvation.
Yeah.
And not corporate.
Yeah. And at least part of the reason why the Midrash, we talked about a lot last week, is so important is because rather than do what we've done in Christianity that takes a whole bunch of stories and say, let's just get it down to a few that tell the essence and tell the right story, and we narrow it down to that. The Midrash is exactly the opposite. How do we continually expand and grow how God is being seen, how we can live, what can happen because of us in life? And I just love that vision much more than what we've often done, that narrowing down of. It's often been the hallmark of too much of Christianity. Not all. There's a lot of Christianity that tries to do the other, and I just think it's so much healthier to expand rather than contract. But it means you have to be open. Let me show you a meme that I think you'll like, Ron. When you understand that everything is frequency, the universe becomes a symphony.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that a great way of being able to think? When I realize that you and I are notes in a symphony together, or that we're instruments playing together, it changes the whole thing.
Who wrote that? Do you know?
I have no idea who wrote it. I just love.
Doesn't matter. I just wondered.
Yeah. I can see at some point if I can.
Frequency.
Yeah, I'll try to see if I can find out who it is, but I just love that, don't you?
I love
Yeah.
it.
And I think that's the essence of it. Do I see you as part of the frequency, or do I see you as the discordant note you sometimes sound like?
Of course, you have to believe that everything boils down to frequency in order for that to.
You have to believe that, right? And
you know, one of those atheistic scientists probably came up with that idea. So
they probably did. But when we do everything in opposition to, and see everything as how the other person is, we have to like judge and see how they don't have the right answer. Like, for example, on my United Methodist pastor group, they got into a discussion about heaven and hell. And it's like, well, if you don't believe in heaven and hell, can you really preach the gospel? Because I do it all the time. Right? But there's this sense of some have to be damned in order for others to be saved. Why do we think that? Why is that the essence of? And they see universalism. Everyone will arrive into God. Everyone will discover that they are of frequency. They just see that as so antithetical to how they understand gospel.
I don't want to be cruel, but the reason so many people believe that stuff is because they were brainwashed with religion as a child.
Yeah. And many of the things that we're talking about here are things that are not just this generation or last generation. They have been passed on, some of them for 2,000 years. That's why Dr. Spong basically wrote off the ability to be able to save our last thing about atonement. That the dysfunctions of that are so strong that he doesn't see a way we get people out of those places. But Easter to him is so important that he has to redeem it and has to help us find a new way. Which is kind of sad, isn't it? That there's things that seem beyond repair. But the good news about Easter, like I believe in heaven and hell. You know what I believe though? That they're all present realities, not future eventualities. And I think the same thing about Easter. The resurrection doesn't happen someday. It happens now when I start looking at life differently, when I open myself up to being changed in such a way that before and after that life, that moment, it's not the same life. I've been resurrected into that new space of being.
Some of those evangelicals would just say you've been saved.
And I think that that's not a wrong terminology, is to be saved. But it's not saved and then you don't do anything else. You continue to be there so that you can be resurrected again and again. It's an ongoing act of God, not a singular moment. Because I think the moment that they talk about is a true saving event for them. A true resurrection event for them. It changes
Yes.
their life. The question is does it also stop them from continuing? Because at least part of what death is in the world is when we stop functioning. And I don't mean just when our body stops, but when our soul stops searching, stops longing for God, stops growing into. That's a death of a whole different sort, isn't it?
Well, isn't that someone who considers themselves saved, if they stop at that point, that is the death.
That is the death. That's right. And don't get me wrong. I think we all go through that. We all have parts of our life that are stopped points that we can't do anything about, that are dull points of life, that are the tedium of stuff.
Sort of like COVID.
Yeah, like the last 2 years of COVID. But they can also be a place where we find truly the power of new life. Because the reality is most of the promises we give ourselves in religious circles don't mean much most of the time. And you know why? Because we don't need them to mean much most of the time. Where they take on strength is in those moments when we are being pushed to the limit and we don't have many resources to draw from, but something speaks to us in such a way, shines in our life in such a way that it allows us to have life even in the midst of whatever death we're passing through.
I was watching Joyce and her background of the horses back
Yes.
there, which says to me, Joyce probably likes horses. Horses probably like Joyce. And you say, well, how can somebody communicate with a horse? That's one thing. But think about when a horse can communicate with you, and they do. And that's something physically present. Belonging to the compassionate friends, as my wife and I do, with the experience of having experienced the death of a child, our own. We were hesitant the first few weeks that we went to the meetings. Once a month we'd go to a meeting, a Wednesday meeting. And I remember leaving it and Philip saying, well, what do you think? Do you want to keep going to these meetings? And I said, well, will it be any different if we don't go? And she said, well, I don't know. We have to go to find out. And one of the questions I had was, here's a group of 15 people or so in a circle. Do you have any questions? And somebody said, yeah, what do you do with the pictures of your child? And one lady spoke up, bless her heart. She said, you know, I had them up for a while and then I took them down. I put them away. I didn't want them to be reminded. And then later on, I said, well, I'll just put one up. And the next thing you know, I've got them up again. And I don't feel bad about it. It reminds me of the comfort of that I had. And then they said, well, you know, Compassion Friends people believe that if you find a penny on the ground somewhere, that it's your son or daughter saying hi. And everybody kind of laughed. You know what? They started collecting pennies. Everybody was collecting pennies, and they're right. And Shirley Bean, bless her heart, she went out, and next thing you know, she was collecting dimes. And she said, I don't know why, but I just keep getting dimes.
Yeah.
And so, you know, if you were talking about earlier about the connections, electric connections or something. I don't know what it does. Every time we see a butterfly, we're reminded of the fact that a butterfly goes through a death and comes back a butterfly. It starts out not a butterfly. We start out not a human. Maybe we start out not a whatever us is, a spirit. Maybe we're going through that, and we have our little cocoon that we can go into, and and we change, we die, and something else happens. And some people have made that trip, and they said, "Hey, you know, I died and I came back.
Mm-hmm.
I was dead for 9 hours. I was dead for 23 hours. Da-da-da. And it's great. I feel great about it." And we can say, yeah, well, that's nice. But maybe so.
Maybe so. We don't know. And here's the thing, Sam. I loved your story about the lady putting the pictures away, because sometimes the step towards new life means you have to set things down.
Yeah.
So that then you can resurrect that picture as not a loss of a son, but as the memory and an ongoing presence of that same son. But it sometimes takes us setting some things down in order to add things at some point. So if you think about like your healing moments, think about how you've had to let go of, because whatever it was had become dead weight and was keeping you down. And it's not the same for everyone. Like, okay, so if I'm in the middle of a desert, a glass of water is very helpful. If I'm drowning in an ocean, a glass of water is the last thing I need. Right? And so you have to figure out how to set down what you no longer need and how to pick up what is needed at that time. When have you had to do that?
And how many times have you missed it?
Yeah.
You should have done it. You didn't. Or you didn't realize it. Maybe you didn't even know you should have.
That's right. Because we easily hold on to something because it's familiar. But is it helpful? Is it giving life now, or is it something less than that?
I think that's kind of what Spong is all about. The reason I relate to Spong is because I have had to lay down of all the, I call it brainwashing, because it's not learning, it's all the religious brainwashing that was done to me from a young child through a young man. I just had to one by one throw all that garbage out and replace it with what worked in my life.
And the hard part about that, John, is that, so I remember probably 10, 11-year-old Jim singing gustily, "Onward Christian Soldiers," with all my friends around me. And it's a great memory for me. But do I need to hold on to that song in order to remember the moment that was important there? Because that song has a lot of negative meaning for me right now, right? And I don't want to have that theology. So I have to move beyond my relationship to the song back then, not drop that memory, but move into a different relationship. And that's difficult, because sometimes what we do is we try to recreate whatever used to be true when it's no longer helpful to us.
Yeah.
So I was going to bring, and thank you, John, because, you know, the path out, when you're leaving this, you feel all alone. And it was stories like yours that helped me get through that transition. But I wanted to bring up, because one thing that I feel that's been left out of the book so far is the context. And that is, we had someone who was talking about the kingdom of God, and for that, he was publicly executed in a very torturous way. And that we've taken that story and made it into that he took on that punishment, and that forgiveness has to be through punishment and through and to see that as a totally different story of divine being somewhat different from someone who would rescue. It's the power. Spong does bring up the power under, the power with, rather than the power over, which is, I think, a foundational part of the Christian message. And then to move beyond that, seeing as a cross, perhaps as a letting go.
Yeah.
Rather than as punishment.
But it means we have to give permission to each other to tell different stories. And sometimes that means give you permission to tell your story, even when it doesn't work for me, right here in the place where we're both at. I don't have to correct your story. And we do a lot of correcting of stories, don't we? Where I think affirming of each other is much more important than correcting of stories.
Yeah, I like that.
But that has to be a very conscious choice, and in some ways a very conscious expectation as we move into the larger world beyond whatever safe community we've had to be able to have this conversation. How do we continue to affirm them even though they speak differently? How do we ask them to affirm us even though we speak differently than they do?
My cousin,
Go ahead.
I have several cousins that are Apache of the tribe of the Yavapai Apache tribe. And one in particular, when my mother died, Bonnie came and she had a shell, and she had an eagle feather, and she was creating smoke at St. Francis in the foothills. And she said a prayer that was just as meaningful, more meaningful than maybe a lot of other prayers that could be. And I don't think anybody understood the Apache words except for the Apaches that happened to be there. Not all Apaches could speak Apache either. But it had a great meaning to me.
Uh-huh. But again, that comes back down to what you were doing was affirming her.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. He mentioned Dave Wilkinson. Yeah. Uh, uh, Bill Roberts is another name.
Mm. And you know what's really neat about Bill Roberts? For me, I don't know about for you, but I never met the man. He died before I got here. I did meet Anne. I sat
Yeah.
with her several times, did her service. And through her and through the stories some of you have told me about Bill, he is alive for me,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
right? He's not a dead soul for me, even though I've never met him at all.
Anne was also a live person.
Absolutely. And she continues to be alive because of those short moments that I had with her. And by short, I mean she died within the first year or so that I was here, right?
Uh-huh.
And so I only had that much of her life. But she doesn't just go away because that's all I had. What are some of the other things that you've had to either release? Maybe we should just take them separately. What have you had to release to get to where you're at today? What have you had to let go of in order to step into a space of more life and light for you?
Well, it's not going to be easy.
It's not easy, Sam, because we like what we're holding on to right now.
Yeah, well, I've got some grandchildren whose parents are way on the fundamental side.
Uh-huh.
Bless their hearts.
Bless their hearts. What have the rest of you had to let go of in order to get to a space that's healthier for you? More life affirming for you? I'll give you an example. Mormonism has an answer for everything. They do. They know exactly what's happening after people die. I had to let go of having the right answers of after death. No longer important to me. My family doesn't understand that or like that. But it is so much better in my soul than having all the right answers. So I've had to step away from that.
True, for me, true wisdom is realizing how little I know.
Uh-huh. But that is not in many ways affirmed in the US or in any of Western culture. Western culture tells you to be smarter than, have more resources than, and so to take a space of relative weakness goes against that.
The other side of that, though, is that the many of the evangelical churches don't want you to be smarter than. They
Right?
want you to take the faith. You're told what to believe, and if you believe something else, then you're wrong.
Yeah.
And so, yes, you have a formula for what you're supposed to believe and what is right and what is wrong. I think it's a lack of interest in searching, maybe.
It's comfort, I believe, Pam. It's
once you
comfortable
make
being
that
here.
decision, you're safe,
Yeah.
and you don't have to think anymore. And you're right, it is comfortable. The problem is, to me, it's all right for you to feel comfortable that way, but I don't think it's all right for you to say that's the way for someone else.
Did I ever share with you a thing I wrote a number of years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, that I called an open letter to my beloved conservative religious friends? Did I ever share that with you?
No,
It might be helpful here. We're almost at the end of time anyway. Will you give me a couple more minutes?
yes,
And as I read this, remember that next week we're going to talk about ethics. There's a whole bunch of chapters. I sent them out to you a little bit ago. It's like 7 chapters and 2 books. So get going on those books now. This is what it says. We started on a road together, you and I, to discover meaning and purpose and God. And as we traveled, we learned so much about each other and about those questions we were asking. And we found answers, good answers. We found answers that allowed us to celebrate together, to be in wonder about the divine presence that had been revealed to us, and to be joyful at the possibilities, religious and spiritual, that we had discovered. But what we found became for you an ultimate answer, while for me it was one more important and large step into the infinity that is God. And I am able to live in the joy and power of your choice to stay in that space, but you continually refuse to even look at the ongoing discoveries that I am making. I guess it's because you already have the truth, but with that truth, you close the door between us. And it's not because what you found is wrong, for it is wondrous, amazing, beautiful beyond description, but it is a finite answer instead of the infinite ones for which I thought we were searching. But you stopped. And no matter how wonderful the spot is that you have found, our search together seemed even more beautiful. For in exploring through the mountains of spirit, there is always a wonderful new discovery waiting over the next ridge. And I miss you, the questing spirit that helped me discover so many wonders, the challenging teacher that wouldn't let me be satisfied with just small discoveries, the gentle heart that loved me when our questions were too much for either of us, the beautiful companion that encouraged me to sing the sunset, dance this thought, paint this question, love this moment, discover this God. Can't we still journey together, my friend?
yeah. That's great.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you guys for your time today.
Thank you.
Go figure out how to be ethical people, and let's talk next week.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Take care, my friends.
Bye.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you.